The show gave you a warrior, a mountain of muscle who followed his father into battle and stood in his shadow until Ragnar died. But the real Bjorn Ironside was not a shadow. He was a force that reshaped 2 continents, and the empire he built lasted longer than anything Ragnar ever created. While his brothers tore England apart with the great heathen army, Bjorn did something no Viking had ever attempted. He sailed south, past France, past Spain, past the Strait of Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean Sea, the private ocean of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. He raided the coast of North Africa, he attacked the shores of Italy, and he tricked his way inside an Italian fortress using a deception so audacious that it would be copied 800 years later in the legends of Troy. Today, you will discover 3 things the show never told you. It's first, how Bjorn Ironside led a Viking fleet into the Mediterranean and terrorized civilizations that had never seen a Norseman before. Second, the legendary deception he used to breach an Italian city that his warriors could not take by force, a trick involving a fake funeral that turned into an ambush. And third, how Bjorn returned to Scandinavia and established a royal dynasty that ruled Sweden for generations, becoming the founder of the House of Munsö, in a bloodline that shaped the politics of Northern Europe for centuries after his death. Ragnar conquered with terror. Ivar conquered with strategy. But Bjorn conquered with something neither of them possessed: the ambition to go where no Viking had ever gone, and the intelligence to survive once he got there. His brothers fought over England. Bjorn wanted the world. And by the time he was finished, the Mediterranean would never forget the day the dragon ships appeared on its horizon. Bjorn Ironside was born into the most dangerous family in Scandinavia, son of Ragnar Lothbrok, half-brother to Ivar the Boneless. Surrounded from birth by men whose names would echo through 1,000 years of history. But being born a Lothbrok was not a gift. It was a sentence. Every son of Ragnar lived under the same crushing weight, the expectation that they would match their father's legend. Ivar channeled it into cold, strategic brilliance. Ivitsark drowned in it. Sigurd was destroyed by it. But Bjorn did something different. He looked at his father's legacy and decided it was not big enough. Ragnar had conquered the rivers of France. His sons were fighting over the muddy fields of England. Bjorn wanted more. He wanted places no Viking had ever seen. He wanted stories no skald had ever told. He wanted to sail so far south that the very concept of a Viking would be alien to the people he encountered. Was it ambition or was it escape? In the sagas hint at both. Bjorn grew up in the shadow of legends. Every feast hall in Scandinavia rang with songs about Ragnar's conquest of Paris. Every young warrior measured himself against the Lothbrok name. For a young man desperate to forge his own identity, there were only 2 options: compete with his brothers for his father's scraps or find an entirely new world to conquer. Bjorn chose the second option, and it would take him further than any Viking had ever traveled. The sagas describe Bjorn as physically extraordinary, tall, broad, built like a longship hull, dense, powerful, designed for endurance rather than speed. The nickname Ironside was not poetic. It was literal. Men who fought beside him claimed that blades seemed to slide off his body as if his skin were made of metal. Whether this was exaggeration or simply the reputation of a man who survived wounds that killed others is impossible to know. But what made Bjorn truly dangerous was not his body. It was his curiosity. While Ivar studied maps of England and planned routes of conquest through Saxon kingdoms, Bjorn studied something else entirely. He listened to traders who had sailed the Atlantic coast of France and Spain. He questioned merchants who had passed through the Strait of Gibraltar. He absorbed every scrap of information about the lands beyond the known Viking world, the Mediterranean, an inland sea surrounded by the wealthiest civilizations on Earth. Muslim caliphates controlling North Africa and Spain, the remnants of the Roman Empire clinging to Italy, Byzantine merchants carrying silk and gold through ports that had never heard of Norse gods or Viking longships. To every other Viking in Scandinavia, the Mediterranean was a myth, a distant warm sea mentioned by traders and dismissed as irrelevant. The real wealth was in England and France, close, familiar, already proven profitable by Ragnar. But Bjorn saw what others could not. The Mediterranean was undefended against Viking tactics. No kingdom bordering that sea had ever faced a Norse raid. Their coastal defenses were designed to stop Arab pirates and local bandits, not a fleet of dragon-proud warships crewed by the most battle-hardened sailors in the world. The richest sea on earth was completely unprepared for what was coming, and sometime around 855 AD, Bjorn made his decision. He would not follow his brothers to England, and he would not fight over Ragnar's leftovers. He would sail south into waters no Viking had ever crossed and carve a legend that belonged to him alone. He began assembling a fleet, not the massive armada of the great heathen army, something leaner, faster, designed not for occupation, but for the longest raiding expedition in Viking history. And the man he chose as his co-commander would prove to be both his greatest asset and his most dangerous liability. The man Bjorn chose was Haystein, and some sources call him Hastings, a veteran Viking commander with a reputation for cunning that bordered on cruelty. Where Bjorn was physical force and relentless ambition, Haystein was deception and manipulation. Together, they formed the most dangerous partnership in Viking raiding history. Around 859 AD, the fleet departed Scandinavia, 62 longships, thousands of warriors. Sailing south along the Atlantic coast of France, past the rivers Ragnar had raided a decade earlier, and past the fortified bridges Charles the Bald had built to stop Viking incursions. Bjorn did not stop in France. France was his father's conquest. He wanted his own. The fleet hit the coast of Spain first. The Iberian Peninsula was divided between Christian kingdoms in the north and the powerful Umayyad Emirate of Córdoba in the south. Both sides had dealt with small Viking raids before. Neither was prepared for 62 ships. Bjorn struck the coast near the Strait of Gibraltar. In towns were raided, coastal defenses overwhelmed. The Umayyad navy scrambled to respond, but the Viking longships were faster and more maneuverable than anything the Muslim fleet possessed. Bjorn used his father's tactics: hit, withdraw, hit somewhere else, withdraw again. The strategy of exhaustion applied to an entirely new theater of war. But Bjorn was not interested in staying in Spain. Spain was just the doorway, the Strait of Gibraltar, and 14 kilometers of water separating the Atlantic from the Mediterranean, the gateway between the known world and the unknown. Every Viking before Bjorn had turned back at this point. The Atlantic coast was familiar. The Mediterranean was not. Was it courage or madness to sail through? Bjorn sailed through. The moment his fleet entered the Mediterranean, history changed. For the first time in recorded history, Viking longships were sailing on the inland sea of the Roman Empire. The dragon prows that had terrorized the rivers of France and the coasts of England were now cutting through waters that had belonged to Greeks, Romans, Carthaginians, and Arabs for millennia, and none of them had ever seen anything like this. Bjorn turned east along the North African coast. He raided settlements in what is now Morocco and Algeria. Muslim communities that had never encountered Norse warriors woke to find dragon ships in their harbors and pale giants with axes wading through the surf. The shock was absolute. The concept of a Viking did not exist in the Arabic world. They had no framework for understanding what was attacking them. Then Bjorn crossed the Mediterranean and hit the Balearic Islands, Majorca, Minorca, Ibiza, island communities with no warning systems, no coastal defenses designed for this type of assault. The raids were swift and devastating. But Bjorn was still not satisfied. The islands were wealthy, but small. He wanted something bigger, something that would make the skalds back in Scandinavia fall silent in disbelief when they heard the story. He turned toward Italy. The Italian peninsula in the mid-9th century was a patchwork of competing powers. The remnants of the Lombard kingdoms, papal territories controlled by Rome, Byzantine holdings in the south, Arab emirates in Sicily. A chaotic political landscape where no single power controlled the coastline, perfect for a Viking fleet that specialized in exploiting division. Bjorn sailed up the Italian coast, raiding towns along the way. Pisa was hit. The coastal defenses crumbled. Settlements that had stood since Roman times found themselves burning under a threat they could not comprehend. Norse warriors walking through Italian streets, Viking axes breaking down doors that Roman legions had once protected. But then Bjorn encountered something that stopped him, a fortified city that his warriors could not take by direct assault. The walls were too strong, the garrison too prepared, the defenses too well designed for a frontal Viking attack to succeed. Most Viking commanders would have moved on, found an easier target, accepted the limitation. Bjorn did not accept limitations, and Haystein had an idea so devious, so theatrical, and so perfectly designed to exploit Christian faith and Mediterranean hospitality that it would become one of the most famous deceptions in Viking history. And the city that was about to be tricked had no idea what was coming. The city was Luna. Some historians believe it was actually another Italian city, possibly even that Bjorn and Haystein mistook Luna for Rome itself. The sagas describe the Vikings seeing the white walls and tall towers from the sea and believing they had found the eternal city, the spiritual heart of Christendom. Whether it was Luna or whether they genuinely believed it was Rome, the target was formidable. Strong walls, alert garrison, a population that had heard rumors of the Norse devils raiding the coast and had prepared accordingly. Gates barred, sentries posted. The city was locked tight. Bjorn's warriors looked at those walls and saw an obstacle. Haystein looked at those walls and saw a stage. The plan was simple, brilliantly, terrifyingly simple. Haystein sent messengers to the city under a flag of peace. They carried a carefully constructed story. Their leader, a great Norse chieftain, was dying. He had fallen gravely ill during the long voyage from the north. In his final hours, he had converted to Christianity and wished only one thing before death, and to be baptized inside a Christian church, to receive the last rites, to die as a servant of Christ, and be buried in consecrated ground. It was the one request no Christian city could refuse. The Bishop of Luna consulted with the garrison commander, a dying pagan who wished to convert. This was not a military threat. This was a gift from God, a chance to save a heathen soul, the kind of miracle that bishops built their reputations on. They opened the gates. Was it naivety? Was it genuine Christian compassion? Was it the arrogance of a civilization that could not imagine barbarians being clever enough to deceive them? It was all three, and it was fatal. The next morning, a solemn procession approached the gates of Luna. At the center, carried on the shoulders of weeping Viking warriors, was a wooden coffin. Inside lay Haystein, eyes closed, arms crossed, wrapped in fine cloth, the perfect image of a converted pagan awaiting his Christian burial. Behind the coffin walked 50 Viking warriors, unarmed, heads bowed in grief, some carrying candles, some muttering what sounded like prayers but were actually battle commands whispered in Old Norse. They wore no armor. They carried no visible weapons, just mourners accompanying their fallen leader to his final rest. The gates opened wide. The bishop himself came out to receive the procession. Prayers were said. Holy water was sprinkled. The coffin was carried through the streets toward the church as the citizens of Luna lined the route, watching the extraordinary sight of Viking warriors weeping for their Christian converted chief. The coffin was set down inside the church. The bishop began the funeral rites. Latin prayers echoed through the stone chamber. Candles flickered. Incense filled the air. The 50 Viking mourners stood with their heads bowed in apparent reverence. And then the coffin lid burst open. Hastein erupted from the coffin alive and armed. In his hand, a sword that had been concealed beneath his body. He was on his feet before the first scream left the bishop's mouth. In the same instant, every one of the 50 mourners reached beneath their cloaks and drew hidden weapons. Axes, swords, knives. 50 unarmed, grieving men transformed into 50 armed Viking warriors in the space of a single heartbeat. The church became a trap. The mourners became an assault team. And the funeral became an invasion. Hastein seized the bishop. His men overwhelmed the guards inside the church before they could draw their weapons. The doors of the church were thrown open, and a signal was given, a horn blast that echoed across the countryside. Outside the walls, Bjorn had been waiting. The moment the horn sounded, the full Viking force that had been hiding in the hills surrounding Luna charged toward the open gates. The hundreds of warriors streaming through the entrance that 50 fake mourners had secured from the inside. The city fell in hours. The garrison that had locked its gates and prepared its defenses was overwhelmed from within. The walls that had stopped a frontal assault were useless once the enemy was already inside. Bjorn walked through the conquered streets with the same calm confidence his father had shown walking through Paris. The Italian city that had thought itself safe behind its walls lay open before a Viking force that had crossed the entire Mediterranean to reach it. Was it Luna? Was it Rome? Did Bjorn genuinely believe he had conquered the Eternal City? The sources disagree. Some sagas claim that when Bjorn learned the city was Luna and not Rome, he was furious, that he had sailed thousands of miles to conquer the wrong city. In others suggest he knew exactly what he was attacking and did not care. The deception itself was the trophy. But the truth of the target matters less than the truth of the method. The dead man's trick became one of the most celebrated stories in all of Viking literature, a deception so perfect that it exploited the deepest values of Christian civilization, mercy, compassion, the desire to save a dying soul, and turned those values into a weapon. The news spread across the Mediterranean like fire. Norse raiders had penetrated the inland sea. They had raided North Africa. They had struck the Balearic Islands. They had sacked Italian cities using deceptions that no Mediterranean power had ever encountered. The response was immediate. The Umayyad navy reorganized. Italian coastal cities doubled their garrisons. Byzantine commanders began studying Norse tactics for the first time. The entire Mediterranean defense posture shifted because of a single Viking expedition led by one man trying to escape his father's shadow. And Bjorn was not finished yet. After Luna, the fleet continued raiding the Italian coast. They struck settlements along the French Riviera on the return voyage. They fought a brutal naval engagement against the Umayyad fleet in the Strait of Gibraltar on the way back to the Atlantic, losing several ships but breaking through with the bulk of the fleet intact. The entire expedition lasted approximately 3 years. 62 ships had sailed south. Only 20 returned to Scandinavia, but those 20 ships carried enough plunder, enough stories, and enough reputation to make Bjorn Ironside the most traveled Viking who had ever lived. And he had sailed further than Ragnar, further than Ivar, further than any Norseman before him. He had raided 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and the islands between them. He had tricked his way inside a fortified city using a deception worthy of Odysseus, and he had survived a 3-year voyage through waters that killed 2/3 of his fleet. Bjorn Ironside had earned his name, not through the strength of his skin, but through the iron will that carried him across the known world and back. And when Bjorn returned to Scandinavia, he was no longer just the son of Ragnar Lothbrok. He was something new entirely, a Viking who had sailed the Mediterranean, a commander who had raided 3 continents, a legend in his own right. But Bjorn did not rest on his reputation. He did something that none of his brothers managed. He built something permanent. While Ivar was dying in Ireland, surrounded by warriors who did not know what to do without him. While Hvitserk was sinking into aimless violence and drink, while Sigurd lay dead from his own brother's axe. Bjorn was building a kingdom. The sagas and historical sources place Bjorn as the ruler of Sweden and the region around Uppsala, the spiritual heart of the Norse world. The great temple of Uppsala, where the most important religious ceremonies in Scandinavian paganism took place, fell under his authority. He was not just a raider who came home rich, and he was a king who controlled the most sacred territory in the Viking world. Was it conquest? Was it inheritance? Was it political maneuvering? The sources are unclear, but the result is undeniable. Bjorn Ironside established himself as the most powerful Viking ruler in Scandinavia, while his brothers were destroying themselves fighting over the grey fields of England and Ireland. And then he did something even more remarkable. He founded a dynasty, the House of Munsö. Named after the island in Lake Mälaren in central Sweden, where Bjorn was believed to be buried, a royal lineage that would produce kings of Sweden for generations. His descendants sat on the Swedish throne long after the Viking Age ended. His bloodline shaped the politics of Scandinavia for centuries. Think about what that means. Ragnar created a legend. Ivar created a war. Hvitserk created nothing. Sigurd died young. But Bjorn created a dynasty, a bloodline, in a political institution that outlived every raid, every battle, every saga. In 1680, 800 years after Bjorn's death, a massive burial mound on the island of Munsö was opened. Inside, they found the remains of a man of extraordinary physical stature, buried with grave goods consistent with a Viking king. Many historians believe this was Bjorn Ironside himself, the founder of the dynasty, lying where his descendants had placed him, and in the sacred ground of the island that bore his family's name. Was it really him? The archaeological evidence is suggestive but not conclusive, but the symbolism is overwhelming. A man buried on an island in the heart of Sweden, a mound that was venerated for 8 centuries. A dynasty that traced its origins back to a single warrior who refused to live in his father's shadow. Here is the contradiction that makes Bjorn's story impossible to forget. His brothers chose blood. When Ivar chose the blood eagle, Hvitserk chose meaningless violence. Sigurd chose confrontation with the wrong brother. Every son of Ragnar who followed the path of destruction was destroyed by it. Bjorn chose distance. He sailed away from his family's self-destruction. He went further than any of them. He saw more than any of them. And when he came home, he did the one thing no other Lothbrok could manage. He stopped fighting and started building. The show portrayed Bjorn as the loyal warrior son, and the muscle behind Ragnar's brain. But history reveals something far more interesting. Bjorn was the only son of Ragnar who understood that raiding is temporary, but a kingdom is permanent. That glory fades, but a dynasty endures. That the greatest Viking achievement is not the raid you lead, but the throne you leave behind. Ragnar's name echoes louder. Ivar's strategies are studied more closely, but Bjorn's bloodline ruled longer than either of their legacies survived. The son who sailed away from his father's shadow ended up casting the longest shadow of them all. The Mediterranean remembers the dragon ships, Sweden remembers the king, and the burial mound on Munsö still stands, a silent monument to the Viking who conquered the known world and then came home to build something that would outlast it all. If you want to discover more legends who built empires from nothing, subscribe now. Because the most fascinating stories in history are still waiting to be told.